Hey guys, sebchoof here. Moonlight Village is the most overpowered dungeon in Realm of the Mad God, and it's not even close. Sure, it might look daunting from the insane amount of shots you've probably seen in videos of the dungeon, but this guide will help you become a natural, even if you're a new player to Realm of the Mad God, and it will pay off big time. You would not believe how rich this dungeon will make you. There's a few key reasons why you must learn and do every Moonlight Village you see. Number 1, it has the strongest white bags in the game on average out of any dungeon, while also being able to drop tier 13 items. And that's just from the first bosses. 2, it's the most efficient dungeon for maxing stats, especially life. For example, if you finish in a small group or solo, you get 5 greater stat pots, 2 of them being life. And that doesn't even include fishing and Umi. 3, it's the best dungeon by a long shot for exalting your characters. Not only does this one dungeon exalt 3 different stats, but since the stats are mana, life and attack, it allows you to do this one dungeon instead of learning to do 3 other cringe dungeons, which are arguably all harder to complete and less accessible because of the need of runes, vials, and gear. 4, the dungeon is beginner friendly to learn. I know that's a crazy take, but if you compare this dungeon to others, other dungeons require you to do significant damage to progress. This is basically the only dungeon where you don't have to bring gear to finish. In the Moonlight Village, if you have a bad petless character, it won't actually slow down the run that much. You also get paid big time for playing petless because you get roughly double the loot, and it's also super nexus friendly, because if you compare this dungeon to other ones, there's significantly less insta-pops. Now that I'm experienced in this dungeon, I actually rank it as the easiest exalt dungeon for myself. And finally, number 5, I think it's one of the most time-effective dungeons for high-end feed power and legendary forge, especially when taking into account its difficulty. Only real downside of the Moonlight Village is that the fame and the battle pass XP for the time spent isn't great compared to other exalt dungeons. So, how do you find a Moonlight Village anyway? The dungeon naturally drops from the Ethereal Shrine, which is an event boss in the realm that spawns as a white dot on the minimap by killing enough set pieces, and set pieces are the more minor mini-boss type enemies chilling around the realm. Though to be honest, if you want to farm Moonlight Villages, you'd have much better luck finding Ethereal Shrines by swapping servers and realms until you find one with a white dot on the map. The shrine spawns in either the carnivorous or floral escape biome, and it can spawn at any time, but when it does it's invulnerable, and it spawns alongside it many of these flames scattered across the maps. They're actually called spirits. You need to collect enough of these by standing on them to activate the shrine. The number of them depends on the amount of people in the realm. You would know when you've collected enough of these spirits because the spirits will flash white when you have gotten enough, or people will say active in the chat, or the boss will no longer be invulnerable and will activate when you stand close to it and start shooting. The Ethereal Shrine fight itself is easy, and following the lantern makes it easier because with enough time and people on it, it will curse the boss and then armor break it. The main concern that you really have while fighting this is actually the minions around, because the minions that belong in both the biomes that the shrine can spawn in are absolute pieces of shit. They're not fun and they can clap you quickly. So while you are on the lantern, shoot the boss, and if you see any minions within shooting range, delete them. Maybe you might have to stay behind for a moment and then just continue staying on the lantern or counter rotate until you get back on it and start pummeling the boss again. When this guide was close to finished, the shrines were actually disabled. So Deca needed to add in new drop sources for the Moonlight Village. They added the chance of Moonlight Village portals to drop from the Colossal Mantises in the Carboniferous biome and the Alluring Blossoms from Floral Escape. The best way to find Moonlight Villages while the Ethereal Shrine is disabled is by killing the Colossal Mantises. I would not worry about Alluring Blossoms at all because their drop rates are horrible for the dungeon for how rare they are. You can use a good clearing class to find them faster, or just rush past mobs only looking for the Mantises to make things quicker. And it's best to also do this with other people looking for Moonlight Village. From experience, the chance of it dropping is like 1 in 35. When shrines do return, server hopping for Ethereal Shrines will be faster. Even if you don't want to do Moonlight Village, which in that case, why the heck are you watching this video? The shrine itself has amazing drops and fame for its time and risk required to kill it. It's a great source of life and mana pots, as well as all other rainbow pots, while also dropping Oryx 2 tops, like tier 12 weapons, and even tier 6 HP rings. And best of all, it drops 2 different whites called the Token of Warmth and the Token of Happiness that help in an insane amount during Moonlight Village, because they both give 100 HP and 100 MP, Warmth gives 10 Vitality and Healing while shooting, and Happiness gives 10 Whiz and Energized while shooting. But most importantly, they self-slow on shooting, which helps with micro-dodging a lot. If you can get this for Moonlight Villages, it will help tremendously. Now, what should you be bringing to Moonlight Villages? If you're just trying to survive in Moonlight Village, the greatest thing you can benefit from is higher maximum base HP, healing or vitality, and wisdom or mana if you have a healing or defensive ability. Because of this, the best classes to bring to Moonlight Village would be either Priest, Necromancer or Sorcerer, but my favourite classes to recommend are either Kensei or Paladin. Kensei because the invulnerability during dashes can help you a lot, where you might feel trapped. Tier 0 Sheath is an item in my opinion that is really slept on, because if you have limited mana, which tends to be the case in Moonlight Village, it's extremely mana efficient, because you only need the small dashes anyway, but you have to be quite experienced with Kensei to be able to pull it off, and Paladin is my number one class to recommend for Moonlight Village, especially for learning, because it achieves the highest base health out of any class before stats from items. You also get healing buff during half the phases where other classes wouldn't, and it's nice for damage. You'll find out why damage is important in this dungeon soon. If you're learning, you don't have to worry about bringing a maxed character at all. In fact, I recommend you bringing 0-8 characters, because extra stats actually don't help that much, and stats like speed are actually a detriment, because you want to be slow to squeeze precisely through shots. If you're faster, you can run into more shots than you'd like, and if you get good at this dungeon with a 0-8, man, what will stop you if you have an 8-8? If you have a spare character slot, you can save that for Moonlight Villages specifically, where you create a character that's a 0-8 with throwaway gear, and play casually on one of your main characters until a shrine spawns, then quickly swap to your throwaway character, and then try to beat your previous record distance in the Moonlight Village, or swap servers until you find a shrine. And if that character dies, just level up a new one to level 20 in preparation for the next shrine spawning. However, if you want to take advantage of the generous exalts that the dungeon gives, you would need to bring an 8-8. As far as items go, on a throwaway character the only significant tiered items you can bring is a HP ring, and a Vit ring or a Wizard ring, if you have a good ability. There are phases that do not allow you to heal, so a HP ring can bring you to a higher base amount of HP to start off that phase with, to increase your chances of passing it. And the Vit ring is great to just swap to increase your healing amount, especially if you do the optional thing where you disable your pet for more loot, which I'll explain more in a moment. What I do is I assign the key to swap my inventory slot number 1 to right click, and I put my Vit ring there so I can swap seamlessly to restore some HP, because wearing a HP ring when the HP the ring provides is missing is useless anyway. So yeah, I recommend setting your first inventory slot to a key that's easy for you, and if you're playing a class that has a defensive ability that benefits of wisdom, you're better off bringing a wisdom ring instead. Now if you're willing to risk a bit more, then there's some other items that make Moonlight Village even easier. Items that give healing are great, like for example Cuban ring from Sprite World, Warped Mantle from Sulphurous Wetlands, Water Silk Robe from Lair of Draconis. They're all great for their accessibility, like Forging the last two I mentioned are pretty easy. HP boosting gear is also amazing, like the Esben Robe from Ice Cave for robe classes, the Leaf Hide from Lair of Draconis for levers, or the Cask Corselet from the Tavern, the Breastplate of New Life from the Marble Colossus in the Lost Halls, or the Fungal Breastplate from the big mushroom minions in the Fungal Cave-in. All those are really good for melees. The absolute best items to bring to Moonlight Village are invulnerability granting items. There's really only two that you can use consistently, and they are quite inaccessible, but if you do have them, they can help a lot. The Seal of Blasphemous Prayer for Paladin is really OP, and same as the Royal Guard's Cuirass. The Tome of Purification is also amazing, because it can be used in any phase where you're not silenced, to cleanse bleed or curse, including the sicken phases that you might be having trouble with. Though sorry, you can't cleanse the sicken. I'm sorry. Now, as you get more experience in the dungeon and you get better and better, doing more damage generally gets you more loot, which I'll explain more later, so it helps to bring a DPS swap out set when you're ready, at least for phases to deal more damage that you're comfortable in. And the bosses are always armor broken, so bringing items that have split up shots that usually get decreased a lot by enemy defense, but actually deal insane damage to 0 defense targets, are the most worth to bring. So for example, like Pixie Sword, D-Blade, Morningstar, and Tiered Bows. As far as consumables go, make sure to have an inventory full of health pots. You can get HP pots most easily by going to the guild hall and just simply typing pots to this NPC. Then he throws a chest on the floor that when killed drops 8 health pots and 8 magic pots. If you want more, you can just re-enter to ask for more. Other great consumables to bring are health boosting consumables like health tinctures or effusions and royal jellies. which you can most commonly find from Lost Halls pot rooms and nests respectively. These are great because there's those phases that I was talking about where you can't heal during, so you kind of have to run with the health that you have. And since these consumables boost your maximum HP, they help a significant amount in these phases. One of the many cool things about Moonlight Village is that you can enable an easy mode if you're a beginner to make it easier, or enable a hard mode which makes it more difficult but pays off by doubling your loot generally. The normal way to start the dungeon is you usually go down with the village girl who explains the basics of the lantern system, which is basically that standing on the lantern helps progress the phase faster. And at the end of the basic tutorial, the village girl asks if this is your first time at the festival. If you answer yes, she drops a barrel that you can destroy, which drops a consumable called tofu, and if you consume this, it will give you a permanent 150 HP and makes it that the boss fight is roughly cut in half in time, specifically making each dancer only having one DPS phase and one lantern phase, not including the finale. However, the easy mode does come at a great cost to you, because you lose out on the amazing mark item, one of a kind. It also makes you get less loot, and you can't get exalts. And you also can't get the second boss to spawn. This difficulty setting also affects everyone in the dungeon, unlike the hard mode. Also, the easy mode isn't just for beginners, it helps make Moonlight Villages faster for if you just want to complete your missions or if you want to farm the fishing. If you want to prevent people enabling easy mode, all you have to do is go to the tutorial skip, which I'll explain in a moment, and when you finish that, just run to the bosses as soon as you can. Now, if you go into this hidden path on the left of the spawn before anywhere else, it leads you to a teleporter, which brings you to this bell. If you send a message saying yes when the village girl says, say yes if you're up for it, you'll be permanently pet stasis. But you must deal at least like 2500 damage to the lantern to gain the loot bonus that gives you a bonus bag after the boss fights. Just make sure you do hit it a decent amount, because if you don't, you have to fight the bosses with your pet disabled, but for no extra benefit. Going to the opposite side has another hidden pathway that leads you to the tutorial skip area. This is designed to make the boss spawn faster, but can be quite tough, so watch out. Here you need to stand on a lantern enough to complete the phase and get the boss started, and this is unironically one of the hardest phases in the dungeon, because of the shot density, how much damage all the shots do, and how tough it actually is to follow the lantern compared to the other phases in the dungeon. Because in the other phases, you don't actually have to stand on the lantern, it just speeds up the phases. I'll explain more later. First, I want to make this phase easy for you, so follow the lantern as much as you can. The lantern spawns in the middle, so stand on it immediately if you're first there to take advantage of no shots littering the arena yet. In my experience, it helps to not camera rotate here, and there's 4 different shots to look out for. There's flames around the outside that leave shots behind. There's little colourful stars that are easy to avoid. There's also lingering dual shotguns of 70 armor piercing damage each shots. There's a flame that goes around the perimeter that leaves them behind, and they travel 2 to 3 seconds outwards after spawning, so watch out for these if you're entering the arena late. The most dangerous shots when you're already inside the arena are the slow moving colourful shots from the exterior to the middle. They deal 100 damage each and expose for at least 3 seconds. You want to try to squeeze through these as much as you can while following the lantern. These shots move in a tentacle-like formation and create segments around the arena. If you ever need to just chill and relax and restore your health, you can sit in one of these segments until you have enough health to sit on the lantern again. There's also these cone-looking like shots that come from the flames circling the perimeter, which shoot both forwards and backwards. After doing the regular tutorial, or the tutorial skip, it's time for the boss fight. A player from the dungeon needs to walk over to the boss arena after completing either of those phases to get the fight started, which teleports all players to the arena as well. How the boss works is you don't actually fight the bosses, but instead dance with them. At least that's how it goes in the lore, I think. Who the hell reads the lore? And over half the time, you can't even damage the bosses. There's 3 different bosses that you face in a random order. There's also 2 types of phases and how you can progress them. There's the damage phases and the lantern phases. In total, there's 11 phases that you have to survive through, with every second phase and the last one being a lantern phase, and every other one that you can progress faster by doing damage instead. The first dancer will do 2 phases, 1 damage phase and 1 lantern phase. The second dancer will do 2 damage phases and 2 lantern phases, and then the last dancer will also do 2 damage and 2 lantern phases, but it also has an extra finale phase after the final lantern phase. Doing damage in the non-lantern phases will dictate how fast the phase goes and how many spirits you'll get. And when you learn how to finish this dungeon, you want to start learning how to get as many spirits as possible, because the more spirits you get generally, the more loot chance you get, and it increases the chance of the second boss appearing as well. And yeah, as I mentioned earlier, all the bosses are permanently only armor broken, so using weapons like the Pixie Sword or Morning Stars or Tachis can pay off. Even though most people would agree that the damage phases are easier to survive through in general, there's more of them in total. There's 5 damage phases per dancer, and 4 lantern phases per dancer, including the finale. Also, while lantern phases are always the same outside of RNG, the damage phases have secondary patterns that vary up the phase, and the previous dancer of the fight joins as well, to be an annoying prick and shoot extra shots. The dancer that joins the fight will either shoot shots from the side of the arena, or walk through the arena shooting shots to each side every few seconds, or most annoyingly, seemingly trying to sit on you and shoot as many shots as they can at once, dealing a heap of damage if you let them give you a dance. So that's basically the only phase you need to look out for. Also, each dancer has their own theme of debuffs. The yellow one has the pet stasis, the blue one has silence, and most dangerously, the pink dancer has sicken shots. This is the one that you have to consider the most, outside of all of them trying to sit on you. Keep note that you can't have the same secondary shot pattern or secondary dancer pattern more than once during the boss fight. How the lantern phases exactly work is there's a lantern that travels a set direction. It will either stay still, go in a smooth circle, or go back and forth. Players sitting on top of the lantern will contribute to lighting it up. You need to be roughly within a 2-tile range of the lantern to make the lantern glow as much as possible. It also depends on how many players are in the dungeon. You still get some value from being further away from it though, until roughly like 4 tiles, but it's not as effective as if you're close. Keep in mind that the lag between you and the server is something to account for, so stay ahead of the lantern while it's moving, not only for the ping, but it also helps you keep up with the lantern while you're dodging. It's a no-brainer to stand on the lantern as much as possible, because not only is it usually easy and acts as a nice guide during some of the phases, it also has a ton of benefits. Firstly, it's way better at generating the spirits that get you more loot chance compared to the DPS phases. Since you don't need any special gear to simply sit on the lantern, both lantern phases and DPS phases can generate 8 flames each, but the lantern phases generate 8 way easier. You need a crazy build and skill on average to get 8 flames on damage phases. Even 4 flames with a decent set is hard to get. Sitting on the lantern also gives you the healing buff, which heals you 20 health per second. It also cleanses bleeding and cuts the phase by up to 50% if everyone is standing beside the lantern the entire phase, from a minute down to 30 seconds per phase. And guys, during all phases, watch out, because the fog is coming. Not really, but there is a fog that surrounds the arena once the boss fight is started. This fog does do significant damage, and worst of all is it sickens, so even if you touch it, it can be a pain in the ass. So avoid being on the sides of the arena if possible, because it does seem to seep in inside a bit. Before we get into the boss fight, let me give you some general advice that will help you a ton. Being fast is cool, but you know what's even cooler? Being slower, especially during this dungeon, because you need to do micro dodging. Instead of racing your friends by being as fast as you can, try to do slow races, or even do it by yourself by tapping a direction key as quickly and lightly as you can. That can help you practice moving in tiny amounts that will come in handy with the tight dodging needed in this dungeon. Whenever you're not doing anything, or you have a bit of time in between phases, try moving as slow as you can from side to side, because it will build your skill up, or at least give you a warm-up. Another tip is, if you're panicking, don't run through all the shots as people tend to do when they stress out. Avoid excessive movements. Sometimes standing still will help minimize damage, and might even be the best way to dodge in a given situation. Also, zoom in so that there's no fog ahead of you if you play off-center. O and P are the default zoom controls, and you might need to switch to a 1080p resolution in settings to have more zoom options, because for some reason, other resolutions don't have as many. Also, avoid camera rotating, because it can needlessly complicate the dungeon, since you need to account for the bearing of shots when you do turn around. I do sometimes still like to rotate my camera towards the boss, but if I really recommend against camera rotating in a given phase, I'll let you know when I'm explaining the phases and why. Because of this, it will also help you if you set your camera rotation key to a key that's handy, because it instantly makes you point north. Also, don't be in a rush to complete the dungeon. Be proud of any record progress you make. As long as you keep beating phases for the first time and getting further and further, you're making progress towards a player who will complete this dungeon 90% of the time. That will be you soon. Just watch this video 5 more times. Okay, let me finally teach you how to destroy the bosses. Firstly, with the easiest dancer from what I hear most people say, the yellow dancer, Kaguya. Kaguya's dance has a lightning theme and is full of explosive and fast shots. Generally, people dying to the yellow dancer is due to a heap of damage at once from from a cluster of shots, and the fight really feels like a stand in the right spot simulator. The boss has a lot of pet stasis, with a lot of shots inflicting it, and this permanent pet stasis during all the lantern phases. That won't be something that you have to worry about if you already have the pet stasis from the challenge mode active. Before talking about the damage phases of each boss, I'll first go through the secondary patterns, because they will appear during the examples you'll see on the screen, and they might confuse you, because you might think it's a permanent part of the phase when it's not. These secondary patterns are basically a way to alter these damage phases to keep them fresh, and each boss has 5 different ones. The first one that we'll talk about from Kaguya is the paralyzing pinwheels. How this works, large pinwheels slowly move across the arena in a random direction, leaving behind 60 armor piercing damage shots. If you get hit by the pinwheel itself, it paralyzes you, which can be horrible in some situations, as you can imagine, because you can get checkmated and get wrecked by other shots. Otherwise, it's relatively harmless. Also, make sure not to walk through the shots the pinwheel leaves behind. The easiest one of Kaguya's secondary attacks is the stun walls, which is where there's a line of red dots that will appear on the floor, followed by a beam when the circle inside the circle fully closes in. This will stun you and deal minimal damage. The static line secondary pattern has 2 caution signs going through the arena, first going outwards and then inwards, where a burst of line shots will follow. These deal a hefty amount of damage, especially when you're exposed. Don't be afraid to dodge in between the indicators. The scariest Yellow Dancer secondary indicators are by far the next 2 that we'll talk about. The first one being what my friends call the rooks. They call them the rooks because there's a small red dot indicator that follows with an explosion of line shots that travel both horizontally and vertically in all 4 directions. As long as you're slightly angled to this, like a bishop, you won't have to worry about taking any damage. But standing on it, as you can imagine, is almost certain death. And even being in the shots when they do fire out can hurt a lot. The last variation and super similar is the exploding drums. These also have an indicator except with a drum on it, and the shots that shoot out are much more evenly spread all around. Again, it's almost certain death if you stand on these, but if you're a decent distance away, they won't do much damage. You'll probably only get hit by 1 shot at most, though be careful, there is player targeting shots that armor break. Okay, here's the damage phases of Kaguya. The first of the 5 damage phases is called the Thunderdome. In this phase, Kaguya sits in the middle, shooting out armor breaking shots. Circles of other circles, which deal around 60 damage each and expose, close inwards, with large gaps in between them that you can move through. You can easily find opportunities to move through the circular rings, even without the big gaps, if the shots haven't contracted too much towards the middle. Attempt to do damage and find the large gaps in the circles. If you can't find a gap, or it's blocked off by an annoying secondary attack explosion like the rooks or the drums, or a dancer running over it, don't be scared to run through the closing circle. Just make sure you run in the same direction that the circle is closing in on you from, because then you'll take the least damage. At the most you'll take 2 shots, dealing 120 damage, depending on your defense. And yeah, you also do have that opportunity to move in between the shots if the ring hasn't closed in too much. Avoid the armor break arrows, especially if you're going in close range for damage, so that if you do have to go through the closing rings, they don't deal their full damage because they do get decreased by your defense. Next up is tied for the easiest phase in the Moonlight Village in my opinion, the static circuit. Yellow lightning bolt looking shots split the arena in half, and Kaguya also dances on this line. There's also some shots that move up and down the arena. The only way you can die is going too far in either of the directions of the line, because the lightning splits off into even more shots. Or you can die by sitting on a rook or a drum. You deserve an award if you die in this phase. Unfaltering Drums is another more simple phase, where you only die to a big mistake. Kaguya slowly rotates in the center, in a very small circle, and shoots out 4 pairs of highly damaging shots to each side, which are equally spaced out. There's also drums that rotate around the outside of the arena, which shoot 19 70 armor piercing damage shots, which might scratch you a bit if you stand on them, but they do mostly shoot outside the arena, so just make sure not to stand on the drums and you should be good. If you stand in between the drums and Kaguya, this phase is a bit of a joke. Lightning Rod is another phase where simply standing in the right area will make it significantly easier. Kaguya stands in the center while shooting 3 equally spaced armor breaking arrows. A circular arena is created from circle shots circling in a circle. Lightning bolts will start being shot from the outside towards Kaguya, Kaguya, but aren't too threatening. The real threat is being pincered by these small walls that appear from outside the arena and they close in. Though if you're close enough to Kaguya, you don't have to worry about them at all. The only real things that would be threatening you would be the secondary attacks or other dancers. Otherwise, it's another phase that would be impressive to die in. Probably the hardest yellow damage phase is Sonic Projection. Kaguya stands in the middle again while doing a small circular rotation, while also shooting 8 exposing shots equally spread around him every 2 seconds. The actual real threat though are the triangles of 5 small spike shots that appear from outside the arena and converge in the middle. Circular shots also go along the top and the bottom of the arena to make it more of a rectangle pattern instead of a square, and it restricts your total dodgeable area. It's best to go against one of the short sides since you have more room against Kaguya, and what you want to do is try to go beside the triangles of shots, and as soon as they pass, go behind them. That way you don't have to worry about dodging another one for a few seconds. If you want to do damage in this phase, it might be a bit of a death wish, but you have to rotate in the circle with Kaguya to make it the most simple, but it won't be simple, it will be super tough. Even with the triangles alone before accounting for secondary shots. Don't feel bad for sitting out doing damage in this phase. Now for Kaguya's lantern phases, which are a bit tougher on average than the damage ones, and keep in mind you get pet stasis permanently throughout them. The first one I'll show you is Rhythm of an Empty Heart. In this phase, the lantern rotates in a small circle near the middle, and Kaguya rotates around the outside, and stops to shoot a barrage of slow-moving 70 damage armor-piercing shots that expose and travel in a tentacle-like formation. Look how many there are. If you let these touch you, you are gonski. There's also a grid-like shape being created by line shots that do 60 armor-piercing damage each, and there's also thunder striking down across the arena that only does 90 armor-piercing damage each. For this phase, the line of shots and the shots from the boss deal insane damage. Avoid these as much as you can, even if that means taking lightning, because to be honest, the lightning looks a lot scarier than it actually is. Make sure to keep track of where the boss is, because then it would be easier to dodge the tentacle shots when you're more prepared. I also find using no camera rotation in this phase helps, because it helps you move along the lines perfectly without touching them. If you fall behind the lantern, just move in the opposite direction to catch up with it as soon as possible. The As the Sky Falls phase has Kaguya going up to the top of the arena and beating his drums to call forth horizontal shots that deal 75 armor-piercing damage each, and silence for 3 seconds. The lantern moves between the left and the right side of the arena and back again, so you need to strafe between the horizontal rows of shots. You also need to watch out for the vertical lines of thunders which move across the screen from left to right and back again. Once you get used to the lightning animations, you'll become a natural passing them, but if you do get hit by them, they will slow you. This is where tapping your directional key can come in handy, because if your slow wears off while you're holding it down, you can run into a bunch of shots, but if you're tapping your movement key instead, it helps you be more controlled in your movement, especially when the slowed runs out. There's also these pinwheel shots, which actually should probably be your highest priority to avoid since they do the most damage. I recommend you following the lantern and intentionally tanking one of the shots from the horizontal lines to stay on top of the lantern. This way you'll keep the healing buff, which gives you 20 HP per second. The lantern often also has other healers on it as well, and the phase will go quicker so you don't have to scream for as long. The last possible phase before the finale is called the Chorus of Thundering Drums phase, where Kaguya goes in the middle and a small arena is created because of the outside shot. The lantern goes around in a circle close to the boss, which you have to follow. Kaguya shoots dual shots, which should be a priority to dodge. There's also lightning bolt shots that expose for 2 seconds and deal 75 armor piercing damage, which should be your second priority to dodge. And then last and least are the cone shots that armor pierce and deal 40 damage and silence for 2 seconds. These move in straight lines randomly over the arena. In this phase, what you want to do is follow the lantern and skip over the shotguns from the boss early while you're rotating to make it easier to keep up with the lantern. If you fall behind, don't feel bad about counter rotating and catching up with the lantern, so try to dodge the shotguns from the boss and the lightning bolts. But if you're a priest, you might want to prioritize dodging the cones since they silence. You can just heal through the other damage. After Kaguya's second lantern phase, if he's the last dancer, it's time for his finale. In this phase, the lantern will spawn in the center and it will slowly rotate around in a counterclockwise rotation around the arena. From the very beginning, you should be standing on the lantern with the boss and following the lantern. The boss is not yet shooting and there's no shots in the arena, so it's just free lantern time. There will be 3 drums in the center that Kaguya will slowly take turns beating. Then after a few seconds of banging the drums will emit shots that expose and deal minimal damage. The real concern here is the lines. Similar to the rhythm of the empty heart phase, small red dots will go around the room which will indicate lightning walls, forming grids. The lantern does slow down for a bit when the grids start spawning, but yeah, all you have to do in this phase is dodge the lines. It is so difficult to die simply from the other shots, unless you do something crazy like standing on the drums of course, which in this phase is impossible to do by accident, unlike the other yellow phases. Also be wary of the hitboxes of the lions, they've got me so many times. Don't risk being too close, even if you're sure you would narrowly dodge them. If you want to make it even easier, you can shift ahead or lag behind if you think Kaguya will bang a drum nearby, but staying on the lantern will also make the phase much faster and get you more loot on average. Before we continue, I want to give a big shout out to those who support me the most, my biggest financial supporters on YouTube, Twitch and Patreon. If you're keen to see more guides in the future and my content in general, consider supporting me to keep me alive by becoming a member on YouTube, a patron, or a subscriber on Twitch. Check out all the benefits that you can gain from supporting depending on the tier, like early access to my videos, coaching sessions, shout outs in videos and streams, and much more. Okay, back to it. So now we move on to Genji, the blue dancer. That's the next boss we'll be talking about. Genji's attacks are themed around water, with slow-moving shots simulating waves and rainfall. The negative status effects here are mainly just silence and slow. This boss isn't the most difficult to survive, but in my opinion it's the hardest to generate spirits on, because of how tough it can be to keep up with the boss during DPS phases and the lantern during lantern phases. Just like with Kaguya, let's go through the damage phase variations first. First, the red circles, similarly with the 2 explosive secondary attacks Kaguya has. This is the one where there's a warning indicator, but it's much less lethal than the Kaguya ones I was talking about, dealing only 80 armor-piercing damage to you. Though they do weaken you for about 2 seconds, so it can be annoying as someone who's trying to maximize spirits to get more gear and higher Umi chance. I wouldn't stress about it though for someone who is just learning the dungeon. Next up we have the crossing blue shrimps. These simply cross the maps at random angles but in a straight line, so they can be really easy to dodge. These deal 60 armor-piercing damage each. Then we have the converging blue shrimps. They look exactly the same, but it's different because this time they come in from the side in groups of 3. They travel in a line curving inwards, so this time they can be less predictable. Be careful of these, especially during the foaming pools phase, where crossing in the middle is already quite dangerous, but this can make it even harder. We'll talk about that phase in more detail in a moment. Icicle shotguns has icicle looking shots released in a spread from points on the side. If you stand on these it does a heap of damage, and it has no indicator so it can be super scary. If you know that this secondary attack is happening, stay away from the sides until you can confirm it's a different secondary attack, but otherwise if you're away from the sides, the shots spread out so it's pretty basic to dodge. Because the shots move straight and have an equal gap between them, so you just have to squeeze through the volleys. The last and definitely not least to watch out for is the droplets. With this secondary attack, shots fall from the top of the arena slowly to the bottom, directly vertically but at varying speeds, so it can be tricky. And there's a lot of them. They deal a decent amount of damage each at 60 armor piercing damage, and they slow for about 2 seconds, which is probably the most annoying part. Still, the Genji secondary attacks are probably less lethal than Kaguya's, but the damage and lantern phases definitely aren't, so pay attention. Let's get into the damage phases. Keep in mind, since silence can be frequent, you want to take that into account. If you're a beginner using a survival ability or a more experienced player using a damage ability, and you're trying to accrue spirits, don't sit on too much mana or you might miss out on damage, or you might not be able to heal up before a lantern phase. Lantern phases are generally where you want to regen mana because you're silenced, so it makes sense. But let's start with the foaming pools phase, since we mentioned it before. There's these shot emitters, and they do 120 armor piercing damage each. Do not pass through the very middle because you'll take 360 damage for all 3 shots. Try to avoid them in general. There's other shot emitters rotating around the outside of the room as well that will be shooting extra blue shurikens that silence. Genji himself doesn't shoot any shots at all, so sitting on him is an option, but if you have that icicle shotgun attack, I would avoid it. In general, this is a pretty tough phase to keep up with the boss, but you'll get better with practice. It is really easy to just survive in the segment that you get placed in though. If you're having a hard time keeping up or being a chicken, counter-rotate in your segment and watch him on the map for when he comes around to do even more damage, even if you're not passing through the middle. A phase super similar to the previous one is Surging Rapids. Just like the last, one shot emitter spawns in the middle, except this time it creates a single file of shots like tentacles that cuts the arena into 3/3. There's gaps in the tentacles though, if you want to move between them without taking any damage. There's a portal in the middle that also shoots other grey shots, dealing 50 armor piercing damage each, that slowly moves in a set distance until it goes outside the arena. Genji also shoots a triple shotgun of shots equally spread around him, dealing 90 armor piercing damage each. As long as you don't get hit by the tentacles and move around excessively while not attempting to dodge, you'll have an easy time during this phase. Try circle with the boss while dealing damage, otherwise if he gets too far ahead, counter-rotate as soon as possible until you catch up with him. Next up we have Bursting Fountain. In this phase, a portal shoots many shots from the middle while Genji seemingly tracks people down and tries to kiss them. He himself shoots 3 of his own portals every 3 seconds, which shoots 4 shots of their own every few seconds. It's really important that you avoid standing on these flashing balls that Genji spawns, because they deal like 400 damage in an instant if you're on top of them as it shoots. These always shoot like half a second after spawning from Genji, so watch out being close to him, and then 1 more second afterwards. You want yourself and the group to keep circling so the boss doesn't sit on you, and so it's conveniently dragged so everyone is in convenient range with him walking into your shots and abilities. Only other thing to avoid other than the portals that Genji spawns that travel in a straight line are the other dancers that might be running around. Unless you're tanking way too many shots for no reason. Next, we have the Crashing Waves, which is another phase where Genji walks between 4 different points on the map, then stands still for a moment each time. He only sits on the middle of each side and moves to adjacent ones. Large waves of shots spread across the entire platform, and they go towards where Genji is standing before he starts moving. Now, the easiest way to pass through these walls is by going through the gaps. However, depending on the secondary attacks, it can be rough. Something you can sometimes do is cross the wall of shots, since they only do 80 armor piercing damage per shot at max, so you'll take 160 damage per wall if the gap is too risky to commit to. At least this is a safe, calculated amount of damage taken instead of like going through the walls diagonally and taking way more shots than you need to. This can be either a horrible or great phase for developing spirits depending on your confidence and gaps, and the secondary attack RNG. Keeping up with the boss with a mix of going through the gaps and taking singular rows of walls allows you to stay with him and deal a lot of damage. He also doesn't shoot, so you can EP him, but you do have to worry about the shotgun icicle secondary phase. If you can make sure it's not that one, then you can deal more damage in this way. For this phase, I like to press the default camera rotate key to point my camera upwards and not camera rotate at all, because it makes it easier to go through the walls without taking any extra hits. Last and the least scary is the Converging Tides phase. This phase might be the easiest phase in the entire dungeon. It has Genji slowly chasing the nearest player and tries to kiss him again. Genji again doesn't shoot here, so you can stand on him all you want and use like the Staff of Extreme Prejudice. Keep in mind there's still a lot of shots, and to be honest, it would be quite impressive to die here. The most possible way of this happening is by the circle shots coming inwards, like a wave. But the most actual scary part about them is that only taking one will quiet you, which severely dwarfs your damage potential. Let me know if you've died during this phase and I'll send you an award. Now for the lantern phases, keep in mind Genji applies in combat and silenced for the entirety of these phases, so if you do have a healing ability, use it beforehand because you'll get all of your mana back during the lantern phase anyway, since you can't use abilities. You may need your HP pots and passive healing items like Cube and Ring in these phases more than ever, since you can't use your mana to heal. Also, don't forget that the lantern gives you the healing buff during these phases, which is 20 health per second. First lantern phase we'll talk about is Downpour on the Barren Fields. In this phase, the lantern spawns in the middle. Genji makes a grid around the outside, which is basically just there to look cool. Otherwise, there's 3 shots to look out for. One, and most importantly, is the red indicators on the floor that have another red circle inside, where if it completely closes in, it deals significant armor piercing damage. It also slows, which is surprisingly annoying, because when the slow wears off, you can move an unexpected amount into even more shots. These shots can also stack a surprising amount. Look away for 1 second at your Twitch chat, and you can take like 400 damage in a split second. There's also shotguns of pointy blue shots that deal 70 armor piercing damage each and expose you. And there's also walls of blue circle shots that have gaps that you can move between. But primarily avoid the red circle shots. You only need to micro dodge around them. Excessive movements can make you run into way too many extra shots. What I recommend doing is practicing moving as slow as you can at times outside of this dungeon or between phases by tapping a direction key as lightly as possible and quickly quickly as possible, basically trying to move around as slowly as you can. This tip is paramount for doing Moonlight Village very well. Avoid stepping too far away from the lantern, otherwise you will lose your healing buff and you will just extend the phase. Also, a good tip with the walls of shots, if you do have to take damage from them, just like the other phase we were talking about, stand so you only take 2 shots from the wall instead of 4 or more. Next up we have the Unyielding water on stone phase. In this phase, Genji moves around in a circle around the arena, same as the lantern, but they're on opposite sides. The majority of shots are from the shotguns from Genji in all directions, travelling at a slow speed and dealing 75 armor piercing damage each, and exposing for like 3 seconds. There's also these lines of shots travelling in horizontal and vertical lines. In this phase it's extremely important to get on the lantern right away. If you fall behind the lantern it becomes extremely hard, because the closer you are from the boss, the tighter and harder to dodge the shots are. So if you fall behind, rush to catch up, spam your HP pots if you need to. You will not regret it, trust me. I find it also helps to not camera rotate in this phase, so you can travel perfectly along those lines of horizontal or vertical shots without getting damaged. Now the last one, Torrent of Memories. My god. This is generally the most hated and feared phase during the Moonlight Village bosses, even by more experienced players, because it's quite tough to follow the lantern, and there's just so many shots and near insta-kill threats. How the phase works is Genji goes in the middle and the lantern spirals around the arena. The phase looks really cool because there's these warning sides that explode into spirals, creating circles of shots. Each of these shots do 70 armor piercing damage each, so if you do stand on the warning side at the wrong time, it's 420 armor piercing damage instantly. There is gaps in the circle though, so you can exit without taking any damage to the neighbouring circle. Genji shoots shotguns of 5 slowing shots in a narrow cone. It has 2 shots, then 1 shot, then 2 shots. And you can squeeze through them, but it's tough. I don't recommend trying. It's best if you can overtake the shotgun, or wait behind until it's passed. Better if you do overtake it though, because if you wait for it to pass by that time, it might be too hard to catch up because of all the shots lingering. Also be careful if you do get hit by one of the shots, because they're 60 armor piercing damage, but more annoyingly is they slow you for like 5 seconds. So you need to watch out again for the slow wearing off and just running into a bunch of shots. Following with the lantern in this phase consistently is probably the hardest thing during the first bosses, because of the shot density, and the RNG in this phase can be horrible. My recommendations is follow the lantern slightly ahead, try to skip ahead of the caution signs if they're going to make you fall behind the lantern. There is a safe spot for the explosions. While aiming towards the boss, the sides of the explosion will be safe to stand on. You will not take any damage as they're coming out. Then with the shotguns from the boss, yeah, skip past them if you can. It's easier to dodge in between the shots if you're in a corner, since they travel further out, meaning they spread out more. But generally, with following the lantern, I find I do a much better job if I'm not focusing on the lantern, and instead just trying to skip all the shotguns, and just glance at the lantern time to time to make sure you're tracking with it well. You can always counter-rotate or chill in the same torrent until it catches up, but it can take a while, which can be lost spirits. And to be honest, I find being off the lantern to be almost as hard as being on the lantern during this phase. God, there's also these silver bullets which, good luck dodging them. It's an RNG fiesta. It can be the worst thing ever. They enter the arena randomly and in a set direction, so they can be easy to dodge, but there's just so many of them. These deal 40 armor piercing damage and expose for 5 seconds, meaning that the caution shotgun will do 140 more armor piercing damage if you stand on it. So primarily try to dodge shots from the shotgun since they do slow for 2 seconds. If you do get hit, just be very aware you're going to speed up again. And secondly, don't stand on the shotguns from the caution sign. Otherwise, try your best in this phase. It does come down to raw skill and RNG, other than a lot of the other phases where you just have to stand in the right spot. Do your best and try to do better each consecutive time you're doing this phase. It can be worth using some HP pots just to stand on the lantern, because it barely gets easier if you stand still, and the phase will take longer, and you lose your healing buff. Now lastly for Genji, we have the finale phase, Tears in the Rain. In this phase, a narrow corridor is created where the lantern moves up and down, and you're perma-sickened. There are 5 different shots to look out for. There's white popcorn shots that deal 40 armor piercing damage each and expose for about 2 seconds. There is also wavy, pulse-looking shots that deal 50 armor-piercing damage. These also travel down the aisle, but are a bit tougher to dodge because they move side to side. There is small bullets with a tail moving perpendicular to the aisle, and those deal 30 armor-piercing damage each. The boss is also shotgunning with thin barrier-looking shots from the middle of the arena, and they deal 90 armor-piercing damage each and expose for like 2 seconds. And lastly, Genji also shoots these occasional silver balls. These deal 40 damage and expose for 2 seconds. Now, this is often referred to by most players as the easiest finale, but do not sleep on it, because if you slack off for a very few seconds, you can take hundreds of damage, and the RNG can sometimes be brutal. Follow the lantern for as much as you can, and dodge the shots moving from the top to the best of your ability. If you are in a big group or you just want to employ leecher strats, you can hang out near the top and only go down when you really need to dodge. That way, if you're in a checkmate scenario, you have the most options to move. But if you aren't a yucky leecher man, while following the lantern, you want to avoid primarily the shots that come from the boss. The little droplet shots aren't too bad, but the shotguns are the things that you want to avoid the most. They deal the most damage and expose you, making all other shots deal more damage. What I like to do is have my camera rotated towards the end of the aisle, and you can cut into the shotguns quickly to make sure you don't have to worry about them later. There's also the popcorn looking shots. Those are the secondary ones you want to dodge. I wouldn't stress too much about the droplets since they only deal 30 armor piercing damage. Okay, now, last and not least, we have the noob killing boss, the pink dancer named Miko. Miko has petal and leafed themed attacks, and the reason why it's the noob killing boss is the lantern phases always permanently sicken. So you can't use lantern phases as an opportunity to get the healing buff by standing on the lantern like you can during the other dances. Otherwise, the debuffs applied from the shots mostly include bleeding, curse, and even more sicken. Let's talk about Miko's secondary attacks first, as usual. We're starting off with the toughest one, the flower petals. 2 pairs of 2 flowers will spawn that slowly rotate around the room. There's 2 on the inner rotation and 2 on the outer rotation. This adds many extra shots to any phase, and the shots themselves deal 70 armor piercing damage each and bleed. The shots start out moving slowly then accelerate. These 5 shots come out evenly spread around the flower, so try to stay in between the gaps. It's also possible to stand on these and take 350 armor piercing damage instantly, especially during phases where the boss moves with you, like Falling Petals, which we'll talk about in a moment. Then there's the corner leaf secondary attack, which has a shotgun of leaves coming from a corner, and they do have a warning to them. These deal 60 armor piercing damage per shot, and sicken for 1 second. The further away you are from the burst, the easier they are to dodge because the shots spread out. There's a shotgun every like 2 to 3 seconds, and it seems to always shoot from an adjacent corner next. Next I'll talk about the Converging Petals, which is exactly that. Spirals of small petals slowly converging towards the middle, with many shots that deal 60 armor piercing damage each, and slow for 2 seconds. Be wary of the slow wearing off as usual, because you can run into many more shots again. Remember, a great way to prevent this issue of launching into somewhere you don't want to is by practicing that tapping movement key strategy. In the next one we have the auto aim leaves. Not sure what else to call this one because that's how it exactly works. 3 leaves slowly come towards the middle and then try to fire directly at you. These deal 70 armor piercing damage, and they do curse for about 4 seconds each, which increases the damage you take, so you want to avoid these as much as possible. Lastly, and probably least, but still one that can hurt you a lot, is the white shurikens phase. Circular white discs are shot from outside the arena in a set direction, and they move slowly in a counterclockwise rotation. These deal 30 armor piercing damage, so the least of all of the shots we've discussed so far, but they do curse and bleed for roughly 2 seconds. Now for where the secondary attacks actually appear, the damage phases. Let's start with the Falling Petals one, the one we brought up when we were talking about the flower secondary attack. This phase probably got its name from the lines of falling petals creating vertical lines in the arena. And also a crazy woman tries to sit on you. She targets a random player and moves slowly towards them. You don't want her to get too close to you because she can deal an instant 400 damage depending on your armor. This is because she shoots a stack of shots that are meant to spread out, so if you're standing too close and she hits you, unlucky. On top of that, they also sicken. She also shoots long range shots that have warning indicators for 8 different shots that are equally spread around her. As long as you stand between the warding signals, you'll be alright. You also want to avoid walking through the lines because each of the projectiles on the floor counts as separate damage, so running it down on top of a line is a sure way to die quickly. Rotating around the map is important in a small or solo run because she'll run you down. Not camera rotating also helps because you can go precisely down the aisle while she might be shooting one of her long range shots down the aisle as well. It helps in this phase if your group is moving together because you can easily stack up damage onto her. And yeah, of course, this is the phase where you want to be extra careful if there is the Flower Petal secondary attack, because you can stand on top of them as well, taking 300 damage instantly as they shoot. In the Wondrous Blossom phase, Miko stands still in the middle. She shoots a triple shotgun that curses while also shooting 6 other shots that come out around her and linger for a while, between her and the edge of the arena. These are also super annoying because they bleed and curse, but you want to primarily dodge the triple shotguns because they deal 50 armor piercing damage and curse for about 4 or 5 seconds. The best way to dodge this shotgun is let the shotgun pass you, then rotate following it closely, and if you fall behind, let it pass you again, and try to follow it, and repeat. That way you minimize the amount of times you have to actually experience the shotgun. Next, the Nature's Cycle phase. In this phase, 2 rings of shots are formed that will deal high damage if you touch them. It basically forces you into this limited area. The boss also rotates on the bigger circle that's formed as she shoots at you as well, a lot. So you're forced to be in this part of the circle with her. On top of this, you can't be too deep into the circle as well because these shotguns start coming out. Every single shot in this phase, excluding the ones that might come from other dancers and secondary attacks, will curse and deal similar damage to each other. Floral Burst is another phase with a fitting name because your HP bar will be bursted down if you don't dodge the shotguns that are signalled by the caution signs. Try to overtake the caution signs as soon as possible. This phase is really easy when you do it enough because you learn the timings of the shotguns coming out. Other than the shotguns, depending on the secondary attack, you're kind of chilling. Also note, after the last shotgun comes out, there's a good amount of time you can deal free damage to Miko because the phase doesn't end for another 3 to 5 seconds. Lastly, we have Youthful Spring. Miko rotates around shooting slow shotguns of lingering shots to both sides. Stay somewhat close to Miko as she's circling so you can maintain damage, but also it helps you dodge all the lingering shots. From there, it's pretty chill depending on the secondary attack variations. Now here's the lantern phases. Keep note that because these apply second phases all the way throughout them, you want to make sure your HP is topped up with pots and abilities before the second phase starts. Now, I should have mentioned this before, but it's extremely important here. Be ready to get on the lantern as soon as possible, not only to clear the phase quicker, but there's also so much bleed that can be negated by being on the lantern. Also, another tip for these phases is try to maximize your HP as much as possible before they begin. This can be by increasing higher HP items, or by using items such as HP tinctures, HP effusions, the royal jellies from Nest. It will increase your odds. Starting at number 1, Vestiges of Bygone Seasons. I hope that's pronounced right. In this phase, a lamp spawns in the middle, with an outer circle being created where Miko rotates around the outside. Miko shoots the shots you want to primarily avoid, which are these purple pointy shots, because they curse and do the most damage, while the shrimps and the colourful and pink leaves only bleed, which are just cleansed from the lantern anyway. Make sure to keep track of where Miko is so you know where the shots will come from. I find that camera turning and pointing my camera constantly at Miko gives me more awareness of where she is and more vision to dodge. You can even stand a bit more behind the lantern to give you more room if you like. All the other shots other than the purple pointy shots from Miko move slower and in a set direction, so you'll have an easier time dodging these. And this is another point where your micro dodging practice will pay off. An extra tip for this phase is make sure to dodge into and around shots instead of just backing off, because all that does is delay the need to dodge them, and then there might be other shots you have to worry about as well. And that will also probably get you off the lantern, which will mean that the bleeding won't be negated anymore. Next lantern phase we'll talk about is Life's Everlasting Bloom. Miko sits in the middle shooting shrimp shots, while 3 flowers rotate around Miko, emitting more shots, and then there's another 5 to 6 flowers rotating around the outside of the arena. shooting even more shots. Because of the flower position, it kind of forces you into this ring that you must micro-dodge in. There are also colourful leaves that are shot from the corners like the leaf shotgun's secondary attack, dealing 60 damage each. Shots from the rotating flowers do 50 damage, while the shrimps from the boss do very little damage, around 30 damage depending on your defense, but they do curse and bleed. Even though they deal the least damage up front, I recommend primarily dodging the shrimp shots from the boss, because they curse and make all other shots deal extra damage. They have a really expected pattern from the boss, as you can see. So do the flower shots actually, so the only unexpected shots is the leaf shots, and they move in a singular line. When you do also recognize that the leaf shots only come from corners, they can make it easier to dodge. Lastly, Beauty is Solidarity is the easiest Miko lantern phase in most people's opinion. In this phase, Miko sits in the middle shooting pinching petal shots. I say it's pinching because there's like pairs of shots that initially expand outwards, then go inwards. They have a very expected pattern that you'll get used to. They bleed and do 40 armor piercing damage. There's also these shots that come inwards quickly towards Miko and then slow down. Make sure to dodge these shots primarily because they deal more damage and they curse, which makes all other shots deal even more damage. Now for the finale, Petals carried by the wind. I wonder how many people skipped straight to this part of the video. Miko stands in the middle and shoots out shrimp shots again that you don't have to worry about unless you want to kiss her because it stops at a very short range. She also shoots out colourful leaves that do the most damage, the 60 armor piercing damage each, and they curse. So these are the #1 priority to dodge in my opinion. These shots come out in free from the boss and she slowly shoots these around. Best thing to do is try to dodge in between them, or even better, overtake them as early as possible. The lamp moves quicker than the triple shots, so it will catch up with you. There is more shots to look out for coming from these lamps positioned on each corner of the arena. They primarily shoot out these pointy pink shots dealing 40 armor piercing damage each. Now if you're only getting hit by these shots and not getting hit by the colourful leaf shots, you'll probably be fine. The chance of you living is much higher. The lamps also shoot out these extremely intimidating shotguns in order, but do not be scared. These shots only deal 1 damage each. The main point of them is that they bleed, so they punish you if you're not on the lantern. Otherwise, it's harmless. The lantern starts out at the boss and then circles around Miko. You're actually safe to stand on Miko immediately when the phase starts, maximizing your lantern time. As long as the phase before this wasn't the phase with flowers called Life's Everlasting Bloom, because that has lingering shots that prevent you from standing on Miko. As long as it wasn't one of those phases, you can stand on the boss right away, maximizing your lantern time, and follow around with the lantern slightly leading it, especially as shots start coming out, because if you do fall behind slightly, you have a high chance to keep up with the lantern. Make sure to primarily avoid the coloured leaf shots by either overtaking them or dodging between them. Micro dodge to dodge as many of the pink shots as you can. And as long as you're on the lantern, you do not have to worry about the shotguns from the lamps. Do your best to stay on the lantern because if you do fall behind, that's where it can get really tough. But if it does end up being that way, stand between the lamps and micro-dodge the pink shots as they come in, but make sure to dodge the coloured shots as well. You might sometimes experience the shotguns coming in from the lamps that deal the 1 damage each, and this time they will bleed you. So best way to avoid the shotguns in this scenario is move down slightly as they're coming in. Remember they do take turns in shooting in a clockwise rotation. So that was all 3 bosses, but there's one extremely important thing I must tell you about, and that is fishing. Fishing is a mini game that you can play right after the main bosses. You can get some awesome stuff, like guaranteed greater potions at the very least. You can get stat boosting consumables that no one actually uses because they feed for at least 600 to 1200 feed power. You can get this pogfish emote. You can get upgraded fishing rods to make future fishing attempts more bountiful. And even the UT armors that the boss wouldn't normally drop. The amount of loot you get depends on how well your group does. It's not guaranteed to get fishing after defeating the bosses though, unfortunately. And fishing will not spawn if you do get the optional secondary boss called Umi, which I will talk about in detail in the second part of this guide, so make sure to subscribe for that. Now generally, the more spirits you get, the higher chance of getting the secondary optional boss. So the more spirits you get above 0, the less chance of you getting fishing. However, there's also the chance that you can miss out on getting the secondary optional boss and fishing. The best way to maximize the amount of fishing you get is to enable easy mode before the bosses even start. Then get as many spirits as you can. This should also be easier because you do get extra max HP. It also makes the fight shorter and thus getting you to the potential fishing quicker. This is also a great option if you just want to do Moonlight Village for the daily missions. Now the way you know if you actually get fishing is after the bosses. If you walk north to the dock, you'll see the village girl, or you won't if you didn't get it. There'll be a barrel next to her where you get a fishing rod and equip it in your ring slot. You can drop it after the fishing since it's always going to be there and it's not exactly a special item. Only the upgraded fishing rods that you can get as special drops are the ones worth bringing with you, if you're lucky enough to get one. At some point the village girl tells you to say ready, then by typing ready you start the fishing. The fishing is surprisingly complicated, it's not very intuitive, it took me a while to figure it out, but I've got many tips to make it easier for you. First, I'll explain how the fishing rod exactly works. When it's equipped in your ring slot, when you shoot, it throws out a white trail, 4 tiles out in the direction you shot in. Avoid using autofire here because it better controls the direction you do casts in. The fishing has quite a low fire rate, and you can't make it shoot closer or further. Knowing that the cast will definitely land 4 tiles away, something you can do to maximize your success is by bringing a weapon with a 4 tile range. It helps you visualize where the rod will land. Another tip is to rest your cursor directly where the rod is landing. That way you only have to use your movement keys and your camera rotation to aim. You always know where it lands based on where your cursor is positioned. I find another way to keep control of where your cast is landing is by not moving while you shoot. So once you do type ready, after the village girl asks, fishing starts and the ripples start forming in different sizes in the water. Depending on how big the ripple is, the harder it is to catch. So if you only have the fishing rod that you get for free, it's recommended that you only go for the smallest puddles. If you throw your rod at the ripple and a fish appears, it means you had a successful catch. But if there is a small splash, that means you could have caught something but you just got unlucky. You can see the points in the top right as if it's a boss HP bar. It's extremely hard to fill the fishing points all the way. You need everyone to have really strong rods and everyone to be experienced to do so. But that doesn't mean you can't get amazing stuff with just your basic fishing rod. I have, just like in this clip, gotten over 50% of the points in the fishing minigame just with the basic fishing rod. And in this clip I do fully bypass one of the tiers of fishing rods, skipping the intermediate tier and getting an expert tier rod. People have also gotten white bags, the pogfish emote, and the feed power items from the fishing with just the basic rod. But as you can imagine, the more points you get, the better the reward can be. So try your best, and good luck. Make sure to refer back to this video if you're having issues with any points in the dungeon, and I got heaps of other guides on my channel, including this one on screen, which will help you get a free divine pet. There will be a part 2 in this guide, going in depth on the Umi fight, also how you can maximize spirits, even during the first bosses, but especially during Umi, and how you can unlock and do true Umi for these special skins and crazy drops. If you do want to get notified when this releases, make sure to subscribe, click the funny button subscribe bell thing, and join my Discord. And consider supporting by becoming a YouTube member, Twitch sub, or patron. Catch you next time. Peace.